I use an illustration twice. Very rare, but this illustration fits so good. And it was just been on my heart. In fact, it's sort of the inspiration behind the title of the opening 3 messages. We've been looking at God's grand design for work. Okay? Week 1, we started in Genesis. Week 2, Genesis. Week 3 this week, we're going to be in Genesis, seeing what's happened to God's grand design. And I've shared before, but my wife and I, we found this series on Netflix that we really enjoyed. It's a clean series, it's interesting, and we can just kind of veg out and watch it. And really we enjoy watching other people's problems. And they're not too deep of problems, but we look at each other and we go, are we that crazy sometimes? And the series is called Grand Designs. And it takes a unique approach to the whole builder design television show thing. It follows a family for several years. From the beginning of their dream to build their own home and all of the ideas that go into that dream, this show will return 6 months later, a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, and follow this family for the whole length of time they're building their dream home. And one of the interesting things I've noticed about this series, some of the homes are extravagant, some are modest. But usually, the people involved in building their dream home, they are heavily involved in the work of the project from start to finish. And it shows this just normal couples, normal families involved in the planning. They're involved in the decision making. They're involved in the meetings with the city, in the loan process, in the selection of certain builders and certain job foremen and contractors, and in all of the choosing of all the materials and their design. It does a really good job showing the architecture of the home and the unique features of the design. And these couples, these individuals, they're hands-on in construction from start to finish. And one of the repetitive themes in the show is that even though they are building their dream homes, some of these folks have been dreaming about these for 10, 15 years, working on plans, working on projects, researching. And one of the themes that comes out in the show again and again is that they start full of life and energy, just on the job site, smiling, picking up rocks, getting to work. They go after it. They just go after it. And 2 or 3 years later, you see these couples, these individuals, absolutely worn out, depleted, frustrated, not sure if it was worth all of that work. And even though they're building something that has been a dream for years in the making, very few of the families have the same sense of joy and enthusiasm at the end of the process as when they began. This theme of discouragement with their work, of losing the joy, of frustration, of being worn out is so pronounced in the show that this theme of the frustration of work even makes the show's trailer. Take a look.
We're officially 2 months behind. We're at least 15,000 over.
It's a nightmare.
Nightmare.
The windows do not fit. You can't change that window.
Well, I'm working on a building. It's a true foundation. I'm holding up the blood stain, burning for my Lord.
And how much did it cost in the end?
Everything.
Yeah.
Well, I'll never get tired of working on a building. I'm going up to heaven, hoping to get my reward.
That is beautiful.
Kevin MacLeod returns with a brand new series of Grand Designs, Wednesday at 9 on Channel 4.
Now here's the question we begin with. How can a lifelong dream, which you have poured all your energies and all your resources into, leave you still with a feeling of disappointment at the end? How can it be that after all the hope And all the excitement at the end you see on so many of these couples. Some of them do survive with a good attitude. But you see on so many of their faces the utter look of exhaustion and depletion and questioning, was it worth it? Well, one answer from a Christian perspective, or from a Christian worldview at least, that I think we ought to just mention, and this is not what our sermon's about today, but we ought to at least mention that as Christians we know our ultimate satisfaction, our ultimate joy, our ultimate contentment in the world is not going to be found in the things of this world. Christians know that their ultimate joy, satisfaction, hope, their source for life is found in God and relationship with Him. But that's for another sermon. There's another angle I'd like to suggest of how these individuals, these couples can start in one place. It's a suggestion I'd like to make for this transition from dreams and excitement and passion to depletion and exhaustion and deep discouragement. What happened in the middle of those two phases of these projects? Was it the people they worked with? I would argue no. A lot of times when you watch the show, the relationships between the people are deeply enriched and deeply rewarding. Was it the house itself? No, most of these folks are pretty pleased with the home they get at the end of it. At the end of the show, they're pretty excited about the way things turned out, even though they've spent all of their life working towards it. Was it the cost of the home? I would suggest to you that the thing that is changing between excitement to discouragement isn't the house, it isn't the people they're working with, it isn't the cost of the home, even as big as some of those costs are. There is one 4-letter word. Some of you are really worried right now. That transitions them from one point to another. It's the word work. Work. There's a tension going on. And this is the tension we're going to look at this morning. You see, after the past 2 weeks of looking at God's grand design for human purpose and to reflect Him and to be a blessing in the world, in our work, in the realms of our life, after thinking the last 2 weeks about how good that design is, how that all that He created is good, how it's good that He calls us partners, that He uses us, that He gives us this royal authority over the realms of our life. We've seen the goodness of God in creation. Today, we throw in that twist. How is it, Pastor Chad, that work is designed by God as something good, and yet we know in the end it is hard and it seems to tear us down in the process? How is it that work becomes such a negative word? Well, you've already probably experienced something very similar in your own lives. Maybe you've started out on a new job, full of hope. It's a brand new career. It's a brand new opportunity, full of excitement, full of the possibilities of productivity in the world, the opportunity to prove yourself. And it's not long into that job, a few months, a year, a few years, that instead of feeling like, hey, this job is giving me life, this job is now sucking the life right out of me. Maybe you've experienced it in the span of a week. You've had a good Friday afternoon, and Saturday, you've had a good day on Saturday. Maybe not the Florida fans, but the rest of you. You've had a good day Sunday. You've worshiped the Lord. You've got encouragement, and you think, Monday, I'm starting fresh. I'm starting new. It's a new day. I'm going to give it everything I got this week. And by Friday, you want to get out of that place like a bat out of a bat cave. Maybe some of you even shorter than in the span of a week. Maybe you've even started out the morning just believing today's going to be a good day. You've prayed. You've got the right attitude. You're thankful. You go in singing a little tune, whistle while they work. You're like one of the 7 dwarves. You're just ready to attack the day. And even by the end of the afternoon, you leave grumpy, unmotivated, and frustrated. How is it that something that is so good, created by God, so promising, so full of purpose, at the same time has this ability to, in our society, make retirement one of the top goals for any worker out there? I can't wait to retire. How many of you'd say that, Pastor? I can't wait. Yeah, see what I mean? How is it that something so good has become so difficult? I've got some very realistic news for you today. We've been talking about these realms of calling, these realms of work. We're using work in 2 ways. We're using work to think about it as a job or occupation. But I'm also using work in this idea that you're called to work towards the good of your family, to work towards the good of your relationships, to work in your free time, to honor the Lord with the time He gives you, with the resource, to work towards the good of your household and the things that you have, and taking care of those things well, to honor the Lord and to be a good steward of what He's given you. And I've got some bad news that in each one of these realms of our calling, as parents or as husbands and wives, as friends, as in all the areas of our life, they're affected by sin. They're affected by man's disobedience to God. And so we return to Genesis again this morning. We read in Genesis chapter 3 about what happens to mankind. And we see that man has been commanded by the Lord. And we see in Genesis chapter 3 mankind's temptation from this dubious creature, the serpent. We see mankind's doubting and distrusting and disobeying God. We see that it's their instinct that after they've rebelled against God, they've disobeyed His command to hide from God in shame. And in hiding from God in shame, we see, what is God doing? He's calling them. Where are you? He's looking for them even after their sin. And we don't have time to read the whole story this morning. And I would encourage you, go back and read Genesis chapter 3 this week. But I want to pick up to this place of after mankind's rebellion against God. Because what God does is he gives them some pronouncements. He says, listen, because you have rebelled against me, there are consequences for your sin. There are consequences for your rebellion. And I want to pick up in the middle of that speech from God to man. Verse 16 of Genesis chapter 3. To the woman he said, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. That language there, bring forth, is language God used about the earth. He said the earth will bring forth all of the plants and all of the fruits and all the things we see. It's the language of just creation happening naturally under God's hand and guidance. But now, when the woman designed to bring forth children, it's going to be frustrated. It's going to be in pain. He says to her, your desire shall be contrary to your husband's. He shall rule over you. Later on in verse 17, as a part of these consequences, I'm just giving you a few glimpses here. And to Adam he said, you are dust, and to dust you shall return. And we start here because I want you to see how each realm of our calling, each realm of the way God has designed us to work for Him and to be a blessing in the world is being affected by sin. Let's look at each realm really quickly. The woman who's been designed for the blessing of procreation is going to suffer pain and hardship in that process. The couple who are designed for the blessing of a harmonious unity in relationship and in being co-rulers, co-leaders of God's creation together, they're going to face the consequences of sin in the world through the frustration of their partnership, through the frustration of what it means to be husband and wife, man and woman. How many of you know you've maybe had a conversation with your spouse and you lead that conversation going, why is it so hard to get on the same page? Why are we going in circles over this issue? Why is it so hard to see eye to eye? Why is it so hard to get her to think what I'm thinking right now? Why can't she see that I'm right? No, I'm just kidding. Why is it so hard? It's hard because sin has affected everything from childbirth and from the opportunity to have children to our relationships with one another. We're in disunity. We're in discord because sin has come between us and God. We see it for mankind himself. Mankind is designed for the blessing of the garden and the presence of God. But what happens is in their rebellion, because of their sin, the consequences, they're expelled from God's presence. They're expelled from the garden. They're fallen into a wrong relationship with him. And being expelled from his presence, the scriptures say, to dust you shall return. It's a play on words. Adam's name is very similar to the word ground or earth or dust. And God had created him from dust. And now because of his rebellion, he will be faced with a destiny of death. Each of these realms, each of our realms are affected. Each of our work areas are affected. So you may be a stay-at-home parent today. You may be retired. You may be unemployed and you think, I don't know if this series is for me. You may be getting ready for 3 weeks vacation. You may be back on the job tomorrow. The point is that God's design is bigger than just a job title or occupation, as important as those things are. And the point is this: as you think about the area of your lives, you need to recognize that sin has entered each realm God has called us to, relationally, spiritually, work-wise, family-wise, free time-wise, church-wise. It's affected everything. And now, let's narrow our focus a little bit and see how this fallenness, how this fallen world has affected our jobs, our occupations, and our work. We begin with the big idea. If this is true about all the areas of our lives, then you need to understand this. God's design for work has been frustrated by the fall. God's design for work has been frustrated by the fall of man. If you're new to the scriptures, this little phrase, the fall, is a Christian phrase that we use to describe this whole scene in Genesis chapter 3, where mankind has been rebellious to God and sin has come into the world. God's design for work has been frustrated by the fall. Not surprisingly then, as the last 2 weeks we've been looking at this beautiful picture of God's design for man, his royal workers over creation. Immediately, we see that one of the most significant consequences of sin is the negative effect that sin has in God's design for our work. And we are still impacted by those consequences today. Still impacted. First of all, we still live with a tension. We still live with a tension between blessing and cursing in our work. We still live with a tension between the good of what God has made and its fallenness in our lives. You need to understand this tension because it sets you up for later on. Next week, we're going to look at the story of Joseph, I believe, and how he's sold into slavery, and yet God was with him. How can God be in such an awful situation? How can there be good and tension of the curse of this situation at the same time? Later on in the New Testament, you'll see where Paul, he lives in a fallen, broken world. And in that fallen, broken world, there are masters and slaves. And he's got to counsel these Christian masters and these Christian slaves. How can there be that tension between God's good for everyone and that fallen and broken system of slavery? You've got to understand this to understand the scriptures moving forward in this series. We understand it well here, this tension at Destination Church. We understand it on the church grounds itself. We have a pretty big piece of property here for the middle of the city, and it takes a lot of hard work keeping this property together. And sometimes the property does exactly what it's supposed to do. For example, we have a retention pond on the upper corner here of the church. This retention pond is beautiful. It's amazing. It works so well. It is incredible. It is what they call a dry retention pond, meaning it's not supposed to retain water. The water's supposed to quickly evaporate or go down into the drain, and we're supposed to grow grass there. Beautiful grass that's easy to cut. It's soft to your feet. And this retention pond is a complete success of our work to maintain the property. It works great. Works great. Even on the back, last year, if you see some bushes sprouting up against the side, those are hibiscus bushes, and they had gotten way too big, so we had to cut them down to the base again. And we were just thinking, I like the hibiscus. I like the flowers when they come in the right spot at the right place. And finally, those hibiscus are starting to come back into bloom after the trimming and the maintenance of them. I'm so thankful that the retention pond and our work in it works. Amen? We have other places on the property that seem to be under the curse. We have 2 other retention ponds that are designed to be like the first one. They're supposed to grow grass and not hold any water so that we can mow them clearly. Guess what? It rains a few drops and those things fill up to your knees. They don't drain at all. They don't work the way they're designed to work. The grass doesn't perk, and the water sits there, and because it's so deep with water, we can't cut it, and because we can't cut it, things grow. They grow like wild in Jacksonville. Maybe you've noticed this at your house. It grows it's like we live in the jungle. I mean, things are just growing all the time, everywhere. How many of you may have some struggles at your home, in your yard at home, keeping it at bay? A few of you, okay. Our experience with these retention ponds has not, we just keep working at them, and it brings out anger, it brings out frustration, it doesn't smell like the hibiscus of the walls. We've got stagnant water sitting there, and this is something we talk about as a staff and as a board, and we're thinking about and praying for, waiting for them to dry up, waiting for the next phase to see if we can conquer the land that God has given us. Now, I use this illustration because it's the exact same language God uses to describe work to an agricultural people. Look at it in Genesis 3 and verse 17. And to Adam he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. That was the command. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of the ground all of the days of your life. There's another interesting storyline here. At the beginning, God says, hey, you can eat of anything. He gives them a command next. Don't eat of this tree. Man disobeys the command. And what does it affect? It affects their eating. It affects their ability to produce food for himself. And this eating is also a sign of fellowship with God. Now even the eating itself is going to be frustrated because of the work. Look at it. You in pain, you shall eat of it all of the days of your life. Verse 18, thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you. Hello, retention ponds. And you shall eat of the plants of the field. Now, at first glance, that doesn't seem like too negative of a thing, but they were supposed to eat of the plants of the garden, but now they've been cast out of the garden, and they're going to have to eat of the plants of the field. It's a location thing. They're out of the presence of God. They're going to have to find a different way. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. You see, today we still live with this tension at work. It's a tension between blessing and curse. Notice that the word work is not cursed. Work itself is not cursed. Work still reflects the image of God in us. It's still our part in finding our sense of purpose and place and security and reflecting God's blessing in the world, reflecting his character in the world, because God is a God who worked to create the world. It's not work that is cursed. It's the realm or the environment or the location of work that is cursed. We're still going to work, but the fruitfulness is not going to be the same. The results are not going to be the same. The realm of the earth and the realm of the world that we live in, there's going to be a spiritual and a resistance there because it's in a fallen and broken place. No longer will we work in partnership with God in a perfectly suited environment, the garden. Now we will work in partnership with God, but our work is at a distance from God. There's a fallenness there, and there's a resistance to us in the world that we live in our work. Think about it with me. This so clearly explains why we continue to pursue purpose and goodness and hope in our ability to do work, and yet at the same time we experience it as painful toil, as thorns and thistles, leading us sometimes, you would think, right to your death. They have statistics in Japan. The Japanese are very hard workers, and they handle a lot of stress. They have statistics showing men just dying at their offices, in their cubicles at work because of the stress. Just dying right then and there. This so clearly explains the tensions we feel in the business of our world between human capability and human error. How many of you have ever suffered the consequences of somebody else's error at your work? And we think, man, Lord, I'm trying so hard. I'd be okay if it wasn't for this buffoon, right? This explains that because we're fallen and broken, the tensions we feel in our relationships at work. God still works through human means, but now he works through fallen human means. It explains how we can love and appreciate and need, for example, our law enforcement, our legal system, our governmental system, but we see in the news consistently the errors of human judgment. We see consistently, hey, maybe we think this is the answer, but listen, they're just going to mess it up, we think. It's because we live in a fallen world. And these fallen human relationships affect things that are supposed to be good for our world. This so clearly explains this power between human production and human greed. It's good that we produce. It's good that there's an exchange of goods in our society. But how many of you know how often greed takes over? And we see corporations, they have this incredible power to improve the world and to cause joy to the consumer through their production. And yet we see these mega corporations, we got to think about how often do they align with the sinfulness of the world? And we have to wrestle with, I'm buying this thing and this product, but I know that this corporation stands for this or this corporation stands for that, and it becomes a struggle to us in the systems of the world that we live in. It's because our realm is fallen and broken. It's not going away anytime soon. So clearly explains how we can experience the joy of entertainment from the work of artists and producers and others out there producing and giving joy, television shows, art, movies, music, books, magazines, apps on mobile devices, technology, and yet there can be a joy that comes from it, and yet at the same time, because we live in a fallen world, there can be an evil that comes from it as well. It explains why we need to be careful as Christians to live wisely in the entertainment we choose to participate in. And it means, listen, we don't necessarily just throw it all out, and we don't necessarily just take it all in, but we've got to be wise, the scriptures say, in how we choose and what we discern, what we take into our hearts, our lives, our minds. Because yes, how many of you know the devil will use something that God has created good, and he will try to use it to bring you harm? We live in a fallen and broken world. It so clearly explains why many people have a love-hate relationship with their jobs. Why job satisfaction is so complex. While we can enjoy to work and enjoy at the same time leaving at the end of the day. How many of you said, I love my work, I can't wait to leave? Why your happiness at work is constantly threatened by the lostness and the fallenness of the world around you and of your own self. It explains why bosses and coworkers can have a wonderful relationship or a cursed relationship. It explains why tasks at work can be sometimes rewarding and sometimes empty. It explains why career choices can be a stable source for us, or sometimes an insecure question mark. It explains why hard work can be rightly recognized and sometimes, many times, go completely underappreciated. And the list goes on and on. It's because we live in a fallen world, and yet God is moving. He is redeeming. And so the next time you're at work and you're thinking to yourself, why is this happening to me? Why am I putting myself through this? Remember this lesson that you say to yourself, listen, God, you have called me. You have saved me. And I live and work in a fallen world. And you begin to submit to God any rash decisions you might be thinking. I'm going to just tell my boss off right now. He needs to hear it. Somebody's got to tell him. Well, I'm going to be the one. We're all thinking it. No, we submit that attitude to the Lord. We remind ourselves we live in a fallen, broken world. You begin to pray for your boss. You begin to pray for that coworker. You begin to slow down. I tell people, we have a lot of people, always looking for new jobs in Jacksonville. And I'll say, listen, I know that this job is not working for you. It doesn't mean you're always going to be in the same occupation your whole life. That's not what this series means. You may come to a place where you say, this job is not, it's not providing in the way it needs to, and I need something different. I always tell them, listen, don't quit your day job. Make sure you have something lined up. Make sure you're not making a rash decision. Be wise. God will be with you. He'll open the doors at the right time. He'll make a way for you. Talk about it with your boss in a calm way, in a normal way. Express yourself to the Lord. Take it to him in prayer. Make sure it's his timing and plan and purpose. We're going to live in this tension. Amen? And that leads us to number 2. We still live with a tension, and number 2, we still live with a calling. We still live with a calling. Now, I want to expand on this idea of calling for just a few more minutes. Most of the time when we think of a calling, we think of a special person, especially designed with some talent or gift for a special task. I'm reminded of this fictional character who grows up to be a tire salesman tycoon. This is how it all got started. Take a look.
So, what's going on with your truck other than the fact it's got 130,000 miles on it?
She's been running hot. I'm worried I need a new radiator.
As your friend and neighbor, I hope not, but as a businessman, that'd be pretty sweet.
It could just be the thermostat not opening right.
That is correct.
And how'd you know that?
I took auto repair last year.
And you actually paid attention?
I'm as surprised as you are.
All right, good news.
Tell me.
Well, the kid was right. It's just the thermostat.
Yeah. So how long to fix it?
Nothing, 20 minutes.
Can I help?
Well, sure. Grab yourself a pair of coveralls and have at it.
Thanks.
Your son has got a special gift.
Gift? We are talking about Georgie, right?
Yeah. I mean, first off, the kid really knows his way around an engine, which is all well and good. But when it comes to fixing tires, I swear, I've never seen anything like it.
Tires? How do you mean?
Oh, my love, my darling, I've hungered for your
Talk to me. Tell me where it hurts. Got you.
lonely time.
I got goosebumps.
Now, typically, in the church world at least, when we talk about callings and talents and gifts, we tend to get this picture in our minds. We think, hey, God's got some special gift for me in my personality. I just haven't found it yet, and I've got to align that gift with just the right special spot in the world, and then I'll be happy. But I think the scriptures don't really teach us about calling in that way. God has given you all kinds of talents and giftings and personality traits. And I believe that he can use you in a variety of different ways in his world. Let's look at this a little bit closer. You say, but wait a minute, Pastor Chad, I do see some things in the scripture. And it is true that we do see sometimes under what I want us to see is a bigger area of calling. I want you to think of calling as bigger than you imagined, as grander, as more extravagant, as more flexible than you imagined. And within that, sometimes we do see unique individuals called to unique places and times. We might think about Moses being called to lead the people out of Egypt. But I've got news for you. If Moses didn't answer the call, God would have got the job done, probably through somebody else. We might think about King David being chosen to be king. We might think about even Jesus choosing his disciples. But if we're not careful, we see these unique times and places and peoples, and I do think under this grand design of God's calling, there are some slices where when I think about Michael Phelps, you just go, that guy was meant to swim. I mean, he just was meant to swim, right? So it does happen sometimes, but I want you to think expansively beyond that narrow slice. If we're not careful, we think that only exceptional individuals get called by God to exceptional roles from God. And the problem with this approach is it sends a message to our hearts and to everybody else that the rest of us were either uncalled or we're insignificant or we're just victims of an unlucky universe. And God's word's not like that at all. And one of the ways this series is challenging us, it's challenging us to recognize that God's calling on our lives, while it sometimes may be really evident in special occasions, unique times, roles, and opportunities, God's calling is far more expansive and far more inclusive than we ever would have imagined. It's not just reserved for those deemed special in the eyes of the world. 1 Corinthians 1:26. Paul says it this way, to a church this church was actually struggling with pride. They were trying to make themselves special in the eyes of each other, trying to get the best spots and say the best things all the time. And Paul's got to put them in their place, but he says this beautifully. For consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. I'm thankful God calls some of us who are a little bit foolish in the eyes of the world. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. I'm thankful that God chose us in our weakness and he called us to himself and he still wants to use us and he's got something for us as we live and serve him. God chose what was low and despised in the world, even the things that are not. If we put it in today's language, God chose even the nothings of the world to bring to nothing the things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. And because of him, God, you are in Christ Jesus, who has become to us wisdom and righteousness and sanctification and redemption. As we've been working through this series, I've already suggested that we're not primarily called to a role. We're primarily called to a person. We have anchored our calling in a relationship with God, and it's by his grace that he has called us who would be considered nothings by the world, and he chooses to use us in our lives, and it may not be visible to the world's eyes. It may not be viral on the internet, but God has called you to himself. Amen. By the world's standards, the weak, the lowly, the nothings, the overlooked. No, God by his grace, has called these very people to be used by him, to be his image bearers, to be his royal priestly people, to be his blessing in the world, in even those lowly places. We notice that in the scriptures, there's this pattern of being called into relationship with God and then being sent into service. And so what do we see? Even Jesus came into this world. Jesus was no stranger to hard work. The scriptures say that Joseph was a carpenter. We know that Jesus didn't start his ministry until about the age of 30 years old. Many scholars think Joseph probably died sometime in Jesus' life, because he's never mentioned again after early on. And it was the sons of the father that would take on the father's trade. So there's a likelihood that Jesus worked in carpentry. And we kind of picture carpentry, it's like beautiful, Jesus is there, he's making a bird and it's just amazing and he's selling them. No, carpentry was hard, menial labor day in and day out. So we can kind of see some hints. Jesus was no stranger to hard work, and he calls his disciples to what? To himself first. He says, come and follow, not this calling to this role because you're special, because you're unique. He says what? Come and follow me, and I will make you into who you need to be. Jesus calls disciples to himself first. He says, if anyone would come after me, he must take up his cross and follow me. He's got to submit himself to God and to me and to my way. Come and follow me. And we see this calling into relationship. And then what does Jesus do with his disciples? He calls them to himself and he sends them out into the world. Look at it in John 17:18. He's praying for them. And he says to his Father in heaven, as you sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. Listen, folks, even though we live in a fallen world where our sin has separated us from God, because of the work of Jesus, we are still called into relationship with God. We are still also sent then into the world to be his royal image bearers, to reflect our relationship with him by being a blessing into the world. So we've anchored calling in relationship. Secondly, we've been anchoring calling in God's design. Calling is bigger than a specific role for a specific person. It is about God's design in the realms of our work, in the realm of our family, in the realm of our household, in the realm of our job or occupation. We're called to reflect the image of God. Each and every one of you that are in relationship with God, you have a calling on your life in those realms to be his people and to represent him well. So even though we live in a fallen world, where our work, our job or occupation may seem less than unique, because we are disciples of Jesus, we still live with a calling. Sent to that place and that location for that time, for that season, to reflect God in the world. You are sent to your family. You are sent to your job. You are sent to your days and weeks. You are sent by God to the relationships of your life. You are sent by God to your church. You are sent by God to your community to be a blessing, to be his people. That's your calling in those locations, to reflect his image wherever he's sending you next. And that leads good news, really good news. It means we have hope for right now, for our daily job. And we're going to show you this last note. Pastor Jesse's coming, and we're going to begin to close in prayer. The good news is his calling, his salvation, his grace gives us hope that through us, God can restore. Jesus is restoring his design in us and through us as examples to the world. And later on this week, you ought to look at Revelation, because when heaven comes, new heavens and earth, a lot of people get worried. Pastor Chad, when I go to heaven, am I going to be bored? Am I going to just be sitting on a cloud stroking a harp? No. God is restoring his design to perfection. And you can read it in Revelation. You will be a servant of God in the new heavens and the new earth, called to work for him back in the garden again. I want you to stand with me.